Welcome to the Create the Life You Want podcast, where we break down the journey of people just like you going from dream to ownership in business acquisitions, franchises, and startups. I'm your host, Jeremy Ames. Today's episode is brought to you ad-free by Guidant Financial. Guidant is America's leading company helping aspiring entrepreneurs use retirement funds to buy or start businesses. If you're committed to buying or starting a business, you can find out more about your funding options by going to www.guidantfinancial.com. That's Guidant financial.com. Now, let's get started with the show. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Jeremy Ames, the CEO and co-founder of Guidant, and today I am joined by Richard Rivera. I'm excited to talk to Richard. Richard lives in the Bronx. So he's close to my heart because I am a diehard Yankee fan. I have been grown that way since I was a small child, so I can't think of anything else. I actually have a Yankee tattoo, a sad, unfortunate decision when I was 17 years old and in my first year in college. But what we're going to hear about with Richard is how Richard went from being a middle school teacher and someone who worked at educational nonprofits into becoming a business owner, where he tapped into this entrepreneurial drive that he had that expressed himself in a few different ways throughout his life, but really turned that recently into business ownership. So welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you. Appreciate being on.
Well, I give a little bit about your background, but I'd love for you to just give the 60-second version. What were you doing before you decided you might want to consider business ownership?
Sounds good. I started my career as a middle school teacher, taught social studies in the South Bronx. Recognized that I enjoyed teaching, but I really enjoyed creating learning experiences for people. And that took me on a journey where I worked for a number of nonprofits, also including CUNY, the largest college city university system. And I had the opportunity to create a number of programs and organizations along the way. About half of my career was spent doing college access, created a college access program. Then when I went to Kingsborough, created a program called ASAP, which was a retention program, and we increased graduation rates there. And then a couple of years ago, right when COVID was starting, I helped tech entrepreneurs start a workforce program to create help people become DevOps engineers. So I've always enjoyed creating new opportunities and connecting people to help them find out their why. So that's what I've done for most of my career until I made this pivot in the fall of 2024.
Well, perfect, because that's a great transition into me asking, what was the why for you that made you think you might want to become a business owner?
I think when I was a kid, I always envisioned owning a business. I was very lucky when I was in high school. I got hired at a Florsheims shoe store. And, really started as a stock boy, but became a salesperson, and it was family owned. And I saw the potential of owning your own business, having some flexibility, but also the opportunity to hire other people. That really intrigued me. So it's always been in the back of my head, but it took a while to finally get there. As you mentioned earlier, I've had a couple of spots throughout my life where I had this, if you want to call it, entrepreneurial itch that I got to scratch. So when my wife and I first got married, we purchased a couple of invested homes in Florida and in Texas and some other states. And those were long-term investments that worked out well. And then we sold them right before my daughter went on to college, my oldest daughter. And then right at the beginning, during the recession, I pulled together about 15 guys, some who were very educated, some who had a high school degree. And I punched up a picture of the stock market, the S&P. And it was from the beginning of stock market, S&P history to 2007. So it was like this line that went up. And then someone said, well, what's a stock? And I said, we'll get to that. And then I punched up another slide that had the S&P when the crash had happened and how it dropped. And I said, look, I think it's an opportunity for us to invest in the market and learn about stocks. And 12 of us ended up committing to $100 a month that we would put in a fund. We created an LLC, researched and created our investment strategies. And I ended up, started it. I led the organization for the first few years. I stepped away in 2021, and that initial $1,200 ballooned into $750,000 and owning some property. What I was most proud of was everyone there now had their own trading accounts. So for me, it was a way of teaching financial literacy. And then a couple of years ago, my wife came to me and said, let's own a business, a side business, an absentee business. So she's an incredible researcher. I said, find it and we'll make it happen. And that was a journey. And through a broker that kind of befriended me, put me on to this opportunity. We met the woman who was selling the business at late August, had a compelling story. And I asked her to send us all the data, created my own profit and loss sheet, was producing a profit. And what was supposed to end up being a side business or absentee run business while we both were working full time in education, by middle of October, I realized I was kind of burned out from it. And my wife was like, well, why don't you take this on and just build it? And I said, okay. And I did. And that's been a journey in itself.
Okay. You just buried like 7 stories in one paragraph you shared there. So let's back up a second. Your wife says to you, hey, I think we should buy an absentee business. Where did that come from? What
I
was,
think at the time, my wife was not necessarily happy with her job. And I think she was thinking if we get an absentee business and if we can grow it, she could end up jumping and running it full time, which is kind of funny. She ended up then, most people leave jobs not necessarily because it's not about money. It's about the culture, who you're working with and who you're working for. And it just wasn't a good fit. So she was also looking while we were looking for absentee businesses. And when we found this business, she had just landed a brand new job that she loves. But when part of what we were looking at was adding for our own retirement, having some additional funds to give us freedom and flexibility when we want to travel. We both enjoy traveling. So our initial desires were to bring in some extra money to either maybe expedite our retirement or give us some resources to travel when we had our vacations.
so a little more flexibility and potentially an off ramp if she didn't find a job she was going to love. But then she did find a job that she was going to love. But I want to back up. You said she's an amazing researcher. A lot of people who listen to this show don't necessarily know how do you go about and find a business. So why don't you walk us through the journey? What did you research? Who did you find? Because it's not like magically business opportunities fall from the sky into your lap, Richard. So help us
No,
understand how you got to the one that you eventually purchased.
sure. In fairness, that's probably a podcast you would want to have with her, but I'll give you the quick overviews.
Sure.
I mean, she started with Googling different businesses. And while we enjoyed owning the properties, it really started thinking about properties. She had always been into some of these shows where you fix up and sell. So the initial thought was, well, let's look at flipping properties. She did research on what it takes to flip properties and learning, how do you identify a market? Where do you go? Some podcasts that she checked out and started then connecting with realtors, cold calling and speaking with realtors. And some people were very brief. Others would spend more time with her. So we started looking at flipping properties in New Jersey. And we realized you had to get it before it went on the market. There are some websites that talk about people. There are people who literally connect buyers. They go out and find properties and they'll, connect with you. So it's also about building relationships. What we realized was for us, it was kind of putting all our money, all our chips in black and
Yeah.
letting it roll. And that was probably a little too risky. The market is changed. It was not a flipping market. But through one of the conversations she had with the realtors, they suggested that she investigate tax liens. So she did all this research on tax liens, and every state has its own rules on how they do tax liens. And she was able to narrow down that in Indianapolis, you can purchase a tax lien, and if it's not paid back in a year, the property falls to you. You were guaranteed a 10 to 15% interest. And then if we got it, we could flip that property. So she did research. There are sites you can go to and pay to identify all the properties that were coming up for an auction in the middle of October. We drove out on a Saturday morning, took us all day, or a Saturday, and we got there that evening. And that Sunday, she had already identified from hundreds of listings, about 50 listings. And we went to each of them. Some were vacant lots, some were homes. And we identified about 5 properties that we thought were worth, doing the auction. We went that next morning, The auction started. I tried bidding the first time and I was too slow. She said, put your hand down, I got this. And we ended up walking away with two liens. So we were guaranteed if they paid it off in a year between 10 to 15%. And if not, we would own it. And within 6 months, they were paid off. So it kind of paid for its trip. On the way back, she put on a podcast about owning a laundry business. And I had gone to a workshop 20 some years ago with one of my friends on purchasing a laundry business. So it's great to be an absentee, it's an absentee run business. So I said, all right, when we get back, find some brokers and we'll check them out. And we really spent from November of 24 to November of 23 to August of 24 visiting laundromats in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Queens. And we almost came close to closing on a laundromat in Queens. The seller, though, said you now have to negotiate the lease with the owner of the building. And I brought in an inspector. The building needed a brand new roof. I had mold in the basement. Wiring was so much complex. And the quick story is the landlord was challenging. And I came to realize that I would have to put the first 20,000 on any, improvements needed. And there was tension between the seller and the owner, and I was kind of acting as a middleman. And when I went to the owner, I said, what's going on between you two? He said, well, the seller owes me back taxes from COVID. And I said, what do you mean back taxes? He says, yeah, that he pays a certain portion of the taxes. That wasn't in the P&L, of the cost and the revenue. So I go back to the seller and I said, this is a quarter of the revenue that you did not tell me. And he said, oh, I forgot. And at that point, I'm like, oh, if you forgot that, what else have you forgotten? And I reran the numbers. My wife and I said we were really going to make decisions not based on emotion, but at numbers. And in all honesty, at that point, she was like, the numbers don't match up the way we want. It's too much of a risk. And I was saying, no, we can make this happen. We can make this happen. She's like, now you're letting your emotions get to me. Yeah. So I said, give me a weekend. I ran through the numbers, and now it's early August, and I had to tell the broker, and I told this owner, I said, I can't proceed. The numbers are not adding up the way they initially were. And I had a good conversation with the broker who he was the owner of the brokerage. I didn't realize it. And I built up some credibility with him through the negotiations. And he knew I was, my word is my bond. And, he came back to me and said, look, the seller knows he screwed up by not mentioning this. He'd take 30 or 40,000 off the asking price. And I said, I'll rerun the numbers, but I don't think it's going to change. And it didn't. And, at that point, we thought we were done. And the next day, the broker calls me and says, look, I have a business that's not on the market yet. I think it'd be perfect for you. I've gotten to know you over the last few months. Just want you to listen to this person. And out of respect, at that point, I'm like, I'm not buying anything. But out of respect for this guy, I said, okay. So I had to convince my wife, let's just hear this person out. And the next day we get on, and I didn't even know what kind of business it was, to be honest. And she starts to tell her story, and her father had been an immigrant, came to this country in the 70s, and started cleaning homes himself, and started to build up clientele. And as he did it, he hired people to work with him. And over 40 some years, he built up clientele of about 100 people, both commercial and office. So it was a compelling story. And then the next two questions we had were, what are your major costs? And she shared it was basically salaries and then insurance. And we were like, well, what about rent and electricity and water? And she says, I do this out of my home. And what my wife and I did was we looked at each other and we were like, wow, this is a virtual business. And what's funny is the first broker we met had said the best businesses to buy are virtual businesses. So it was kind of coming through. So we realized the costs were going to be much lower. And she said also, if a client cancels on you, the cleaner doesn't get paid. So if your revenue drops, so do your salaries. And then the last question that was a real clincher for us was, well, what do you pay your workers? Because I didn't want to get into a business where it was based on exploiting our workers. And she said, well, I pay them $20 an hour, and minimum wage was 15. So it was not, exploiting. It was somewhat of a living wage, not close to it, but getting there. So we said, well, give us a little time. And that night we called her back and said, we're interested. And I said, I'm going to send you a laundry list of stuff. She did. We met the first week of September, and then we closed 2 months later. So that was,
Wow,
our
that's the full
paths.
circle.
Yeah,
So, a couple things I want to highlight about your story there, Richard, that I think are compelling. One is trust. When you're negotiating to buy a business, you are relying a lot on the person that you're buying it from because you're going to base your decision on the information they're sharing. So when something happens like, oh, I forgot to share that a quarter of the net income doesn't really exist because it goes to back taxes, it's hard not then to question everything else that they're disclosing to you, right? It becomes a,
absolutely. Absolutely. You can do all the research you want, but to the point you just made, there's going to be a certain point where you have to take a leap of faith. And part of that leap of faith of, do I make this investment? Because you're kind of going into the unknown, right? And there's all these other things that can happen that can impact the business. Is, well, how much do you trust this person who's selling you the business, and why are they selling it, and all? So that she was looking to retire was a compelling reason, you know? So I totally agree with what you just said.
yeah, and it sounds like another thing that was key there is the way that you and your wife approached looking at this business made an impression on this business broker. You were serious. You knew what you wanted in terms of how the numbers needed to add up. And so when this deal fell apart, he immediately thought of you for the next thing that came up and said, hey, there are some serious buyers here. And I think people underappreciate how much brokers look at your level of preparation to understand if you're somebody worth investing time in. Because for them, they get lots of people that want to own businesses, but few people who are going to jump through all the hoops and do all the work that's required to close them out. Did you ever have any follow up conversations with this broker to
Still in
talk about
touch
that?
with him periodically today. You know, I'll call him and ask him for advice. So, and it's funny because I got to know him because some of the other brokers, he was the most senior, he owned the company. They would say, well, why don't you ask this gentleman? And we went through a couple of properties that were through them. When we did the P&Ls, we came right back and said, look, we'd like to continue, but they're not making a profit. So the brokers realized we were for real and everything was going to be numbers driven. And then when there were some points where I needed some direction, I called him. I wasn't looking to take advantage of anyone, but I was like, how do I negotiate this? So he gave me really good advice. And so to your point, besides trust, relationships are critical. And I did not realize that I was building a trusting, credible relationship with him. But my wife and I are very simple and straight up. So, you know, and I think he recognized that. But it was a huge benefit because if he hadn't reached out to us, I wouldn't be on this call with you today. And
Yeah,
we
you
would not own a business right now. So, you know, those little things do go a long way.
I want to go back to something you said about the you were crunching the numbers and the numbers didn't work. What were you looking for when you were putting the numbers together? How did you what were you targeting and why?
Yeah, you know, I realized this when we purchased the houses. Purchasing a house can be very overwhelming. Purchase, you know, business can be overwhelming. But in many ways, it's real simple math. You add up, you identify and add up what are all your expenses per month. You add up, and this can be a little tricky where you have to get confirmation. What are the streams of revenue? And then it's simple math. If you make X amount in revenue and you have X amount in costs, is the end number a net profit or a net negative? And then you do that over 12 months. And then you can then determine, well, what's the average cost? What's the average revenue? And you see, is there a certain flow to the business? And if so, why? And you investigate. So in some ways, it's real basic math. But what you got to do is research. Like there is a guy who created an organization about people who want to buy laundromats. So when we started this, we paid the subscription and we bought a manual, all the questions to ask. You know, the profit P&L statement, I didn't know that from hand. It was a recommendation. What you want to do is create a P&L and ask for past statements where you can see the actual, you know, what did they pay in electricity, in water bills and all of that. So it was simply creating that, and it's a process. And then it's running the numbers and letting the numbers kind of dictate, is this going to, you know, And I think then part of the other conversations are there opportunities to grow the business. So, for example, at the height of the home and office cleaning business, her father had over 100 clients. COVID happened, people move, people pass away. When her parents had retired, she spent the last couple of years taking care of them because they got ill. By the time we purchased it, she only had 40 clients. But even with the 40 and her staff was still making a profit.
Yeah.
But I'm like, wow, if there's 40 and there was the height of 100, I can grow the business. They're in one county in New York. I've since now expanded and I'm now trying to market the business in two other adjacent counties. So I was looking at, is the business, if I didn't do anything, am I making money? And then are there growth opportunities?
Yeah.
And if so, that's a win-win.
And it sounds like in this case, you based the growth opportunity on what the business had done prior to COVID. And you said, hey, if this could do this before, it could do it after. It's just a question of putting the effort into the marketing. I'm curious, I want to verify. So, to go through the financials, you asked for individual monthly profit and loss statements, and then you put them into your own spreadsheet so you could look at the trajectory of, hey, utilities month over month, and when might they look large or small, or when do they have a month where they paid two expenses and in another month they paid zero. What did you learn when you put together the P&Ls?
Well, you learn about the seller in many ways. There were a couple of people that, when we asked for the information, they maybe sent a couple of months. And I said, no, no, I need to 6 months to a year so I could project. And some of them said, no, I'm not giving it to you. Why? I don't know. Sometimes there were, bills that didn't make any sense. And then it was a conversation of, why
Give me
did
an
you not
example.
pay? So for one of the laundromats, they were paying very little in water and electricity, and then all of a sudden it ballooned. So when we asked the owner what happened, came to learn that the boiler had gone. He had no hot water for some time, and then they had to replace the boiler, so he had to take it. So this was all good to know because he was renting space from the building. So you start to understand the stories of, why are you selling? I think asking or trying to figure out why someone is selling is really important. Is it that they got into it and it's really a money loser and the numbers, they're propping up numbers in a certain way and then all of a sudden you're in trouble? Is it that they're ready to retire, or they're transitioning to another business? So what are the motivations of the sellers? And many times going through the numbers help to fill out the story and ask questions to get clarity on why that was. With the laundromat that we were really going to buy, what I came to realize through multiple conversations, the owner was pressured in many ways by his parents, whose aunt and uncle owned a laundry business, to purchase a laundry business. And when he did, he basically stuck his wife there to run it because he had a really good union job. And in talking with the wife over time, I came to realize, she goes, I just don't like people. Like, I don't like the customer service. I want to do the work, but I don't want to talk to people.
Yeah.
So she was kind of done. So, they were motivated sellers, not because it wasn't making money per se, but because she was like, look, if we don't sell this, I'm going to break up with you because I'm done. I want to go back to school. And, but then he didn't share some information. So that led to the issue of trust. So, the numbers lead to conversations. And I think understanding people's motivations, I love hearing people's origin stories. How did you end up here? Why did you end up here? What have you learned since you've been here? And why are you now trying to exit? And does that all correlate? It helps you to gauge whether this is the right thing for you.
I'm hearing that when you're looking to buy a business, trust is critical because you're relying on so much information that's coming from a seller. So you know that when you get the original story, it's just that, a story. And what it sounds like you do is use this combination of financials and trying to understand the business to learn more about the seller in a way that helps you determine, is there alignment in their story across
Mhm.
all these things that I'm seeing, or am I starting to see inconsistencies because they're saying one thing that makes them look good here, But in reality, when I start digging in, it's something different. And so now I maybe should be questioning a lot of the things that are being shared.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. It was funny with purchasing the cleaning business. She said she had 40 clients and she said she had 8 staff and she wanted to close quite quickly. And her son is a lawyer, so he was very protective of her. And, we were going back and forth trying to meet each other's needs. And I said, look, her concern, rightfully so, is if I show you my clientele list, my staff, how do I know you're going to not pull out and then try and steal them? Right? She didn't know who I was. And I said, I totally get you. I said, at the same token, don't ask me to all of a sudden give you the full amount. And then I go to look and you don't have 40 clients, you have 15. You don't have 8 staff, you got 3, because then I'm in trouble. So what I did was, I said, there has to be a leap of faith on both sides, but we also have to protect our own individual pieces. So we closed. I sent the check, but I asked that it could not be deposited for 24 hours. And she sat down with me, and like we literally closed, and I brought her the check. I sat down with her, and she showed me the clientele list, the staff list. She verified it, right? And then we went to the bank together to deposit it, right? There had to be a certain level of trust, but there was, through those conversations, and some of them weren't easy, was like, I'm not looking to screw you, and I totally understand where you're coming from. At the same time, I can't screw myself. So
Yeah.
how do we make this work? And I think in being honest, just being blunt, honest, and recognizing, those things, I think also built credibility on both sides. And this woman has really become a mentor to us. I'm still in touch with her weekly, whether it be email or text, because she believed in her father's business and she wanted to sell to someone who'd kind of follow through. I'm just launching a new website, and on the about page, it starts with their story and a picture of them. And she was really touched. And I did that partly, you got to know where you've come from to know where you're going,
Yep.
and without his commitment and without their work, I would not be here, so it's important to honor what they've achieved and also say we want to follow through on the similar traditions. He believed that every client is unique and you approach them by meeting their needs. And that's something that I believe. And I think that builds credibility, because in this business, the only thing I have is my credibility, right? I mean, there are a lot of people, both who are working under the table as well as formally, who are trying to get people's business. So the only way I'm going to get business is building relationships and people knowing that what I say, I'm going to follow through on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the other things you're highlighting here, Richard, is how valuable it is to think about the relationship with the seller almost like a partnership. If this is somebody you're partnering with one way or another, right? Because you're going to have this shared experience around this thing, and almost guaranteed that not everything is going to go as you expected. In fact, most of the really successful business acquirers that I've talked with have had really good relationships with the seller.
Yeah.
It's often the only way to get the deal done because things will come up in the deal process, like you talked about, where there's a challenge to work through and you got to figure out how to find the win-win. And then after somebody takes ownership of a business, there's almost always some curveball that gets thrown. So I want to hear, Richard, what has been the biggest curveball that you have found since taking over this business?
I want to make a comment on what you just said, and I'll throw you a
Sure.
couple of curveballs. To the partnership piece, we asked her in coming on board, we want to announce, because we didn't want to, shake the status quo for the staff and the clients. We said, could we announce that you've taken on partners? She sold the business to us, but in November, she emailed and called people, and we sent letters saying, hey, I'm going to be taking a step back. I've brought on Richard and Cindy, and they're going to be working with me. And that has been a slow transition where in the new website, we're kind of announcing that we're formally taking over. But the partnership piece is really important because we wanted to send a message to the clients and to the staff that we weren't changing anything, status quo. So one of the first things we said, look, this year we're not making any increases in costs or whatever. We really spent time with her to understand how she did things and followed suit. And I think that has helped pave the way. Um, I think I don't know if it's too, I think one is a curveball, but I'll share two quick stories. In education, I was always very focused on outcomes. I knew the importance of relationships, but I was always focused on who we're serving, how do we meet their needs. And I built relationships with my staff and other partners based on getting to those outcomes. In my last job, and I think one of the reasons why I was not happy was at a national office. I was a chief program officer. And I remember having a conversation with the CEO, and he said, your focus can't be on outcomes anymore. It has to be on relationships. And I shifted that. But, you know, as I was trying to spend time in dealing with the politics of getting to know people from across the country, I felt some of our students were falling further and further behind. And I'm very much about outcomes. And that was a realization I had when I left there. And then I start this business, and it's just the exact opposite. It's not about outcomes. It's all about relationships. So the way I'm going to grow my business is I'm in a couple of networking groups. I have to meet with people and establish relationships first and build credibility. And then if they trust me, then they'll start to refer me. And if they have a good experience with me, then, and I've seen it play out. So when I first went to those network groups, I was kind of quiet and shy. I would do my quick pitch. And then I started, you know, as confidence grew, I would go up to a couple people, can we meet? And, you know, I love the origin story. So tell me how you got your business. And then they would tell me, ask me mine. And I told them, and, you know, I told them what I was about. And when we would go back, you know, a couple of them said, hey, I had the opportunity to meet with this guy. He's straight up. I really encourage you to meet with him. A couple of them said, hey, I have some opportunities. Took advantage, did a really good job. And so my credibility is getting strengthened each time. So, you know, I had a shift, and that was an important shift. That was a curveball for me. Um, Going back to trust, I had a commercial client, and they asked us to expand the cleaning, and we did. And this client, you know, we were in offices where they had sensitive paperwork. And one of my cleaners, I think a couple of times had a, you know, other business that she had to. So she brought in her teenage daughter to help her. And they contacted me and they said, you know, we really can't have the daughter cleaning with the mom. And I said, no problem. And I let the cleaner know. And I then get a call a couple of months later. And they said, you know, we looked at the video and the daughter was in there again with the mom cleaning. And they ended the contract with us. And that was really hard because they were really happy with the cleaning, but we had broke trust. And what was frustrating was I didn't break the trust. I had communicated with my staff person not to do it. And behind my back, she did it that once. And as I tried to amend it, I couldn't. So we lost the business. I was really angry with her because I didn't trust her now. And I really contemplated, do I fire her or do I, you know, continue with her? And, you know, I spoke with my wife and then I sat down with her and I said, if this ever happens again, it's done. Trust is the primary thing. You cannot break the trust. So it's taken a while to kind of heal that piece. You know, I need, you know, but people make mistakes. You know, so that was a curveball of losing someone and my own credibility, you know, because of the actions of somebody else. So, you know, I take great care when I'm meeting with staff. You know, I'm a matchmaker. So I need to make sure I'm meeting the client's needs, meeting the cleaner's needs. You know, it's important to me for the cleaners that they get a living wage, that they are moving forward, because this is an entry level position. So I recognize that. I don't want to be taking advantage of people, but trust is really important. So that was a curveball for me, you know, of having to kind of recover from that. And, you know, do you fire someone and do you, you know, and then risk it? And then how do you move forward with that person and repair it?
Richard, I am convinced that that is one of the hardest parts of owning a business is that in order to scale a company, you have to have trust in other people, and yet you are the one who's 100% accountable for the results. And that's a hard place for people to be, right? And a lot of us are drawn to business ownership for that sense of control. right? The control we didn't have in corporate jobs that now in these businesses where we own, we have that control. And sometimes that can hold us back from the ability to grow our businesses because it doesn't work without trust. It doesn't work if you don't have cleaners that you can trust to go out there and represent your brand. And the problem with that is that if you do this long enough and you hire enough people and scale enough, someone is going to disappoint you. Someone is going to make a mistake. Someone is going to screw something up. And you're the one who's
Yeah.
maybe falling on the sword with your client or with your revenue or with something else.
No.
Can you speak at all to that?
Yeah, no, you're 100%. And I did learn this lesson. I used to manage partnerships between nonprofits and schools. I got to visit a lot of schools, and I realized something early on. When you had a really good school, good culture, good outcomes, you had a strong leader and you had an incredible team. And everyone deserved the credit. But I also went into some really underperforming schools, not good culture. And what I realized was many times you had really good, dedicated teachers, good staff, and you had poor leadership. And I think that's the power of leadership in setting culture and all. And I walked away from that experience saying, when you succeed, everyone succeeds, not just one person. But when there's failure, it's on the leader. So I've taken that lesson over here. I've also come to realize that I believe that mistakes are our greatest teachers. But when we make mistakes, we have to be honest with each other so we learn from them. If you hide mistakes, then that's the problem. So, I think for me, one of the reasons why I stayed with this person was when I was told and notified that she had brought in her daughter, and I went back and I confronted and I said, "Did you bring your daughter in?" She didn't lie to me. She said, "Yeah, I did." Right. So she acknowledged and she goes, "I know I wasn't supposed to." Right. She acknowledged the mistake. It was a little too late, but at least she didn't lie to me in that situation. So I think that's really important. I've also come to recognize too, like there are consultancies or businesses where the work is all on you, right? And that's like individual income. The work that I'm in is it's a multifaceted income. Like I set up a schedule. I have cleaners in different locations, and there's all this income that comes back. And if I've done my job right, and I don't hear from my clients, I see my my staff once a week, and we're good. To check in with the new schedule, right? So I'm really relying on them to bring me the revenue that I want and need, right? Which means if I'm going to succeed, they have to succeed. So I'm very clear in asking them, how is it going? What do you need? What is going on with the clients? And trying to be supportive of them. Because if I'm not supportive of them, then I'm going to lose them. My credibility with my staff is equally important with my clients. I had a new customer who, when I sent one staff, wasn't necessarily happy. I sent another staff member, and she came back to me and she said his wife, and we had agreed what the scope of work was going to be, and she went beyond it. And she said, I did it, but she was clearly frustrated. And I said, look, if this happens again, tell her no and call me, because we've agreed to a scope. And I followed up with the husband and I said, to be clear, here's the scope of work. If you want anything more, you need to let us know because it could impact price. The woman went back. The wife again wanted this, this, and this. This time the woman said no. My boss said no. And then the husband called me and said, I'm ending service with you. And I said, no problem. There was not a good match. I want to meet your needs, but let's be clear up front. What are they? You can't say one thing and do something else. But the staff member also knew I had her back when I said, this is what, and I showed her the email. This is what we've agreed to. This is what you do. If they want more, call me and I'll talk with them. Or you can say that's not part of the scope of work. So finding that balance is really important.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on another important thing is being willing to fire customers that aren't a fit. In fact, I think most businesses I've seen, this has been true of the couple of businesses that I've acquired, there are always some number of clients that you're losing money on every single month, every single year. You go into any business, you start breaking it down by customer, and you'll find them. And there's real hesitation, I think, when someone takes over a new business saying, well, I can't let go of any revenue that's here. So if you had any experience like that when you're going through these scopes, you're going through what people are paying, or has it lined up where every customer's been profitable and life's been good?
Yeah, no, I think there are more profitable customers than others. So, for example, I lost a commercial client and I just recently gained a commercial client, which is good. But the economic difference of what I lost and what I gained, I'm probably earning now maybe a quarter of what was earning with the other person. So economically, while it's nice to have a new one, I'm still down on revenue, right? Um, it's finding that fit. I'm trying to practice what I call moral capitalism. I want to provide the customer a quality service at an affordable price, but I also want to ensure that my staff make a living wage. So when I go about quoting a business, I find out what do you need, and to me, it's real simple now. How long is it going to take? At that point, it's what I'm paying the person per hour, right? So
Yep.
that's my minimal cost. Then there's some other costs. And then what's a reasonable profit without taking advantage? I also recognize there's a lot of competition, so I can't be overpriced, right? So I have to provide excellent customer service and be reasonable. There have been times where I've provided a reasonable quote, and I've had some people say, I can get it cheaper for that. And I say, okay, I hear you. I can't go any lower because I'm not going to take advantage of my staff, right?
Yep.
So it's like what I say is, look, what I can provide is quality service and consistency. And if for some reason someone doesn't show, I can get someone else there. But if you got an issue, I'm down to listen. The new commercial client that I have, it was an interesting text I got. I said, let me know if I get the job or not. She had to send it to her boss. I said, I really would appreciate your feedback. And her response was, I hope you get it because you're the only vendor that I've started to enjoy talking with in the last 2 years. And it was partly because I was very honest and very clear. What do you need? This is what we can do. And I think she appreciated that exchange, and it was an affordable price, that my staff get paid what they need and I make a profit. Is it, would I like a larger profit? Yeah, but I don't, I got to grow it slowly but surely. So I think the way I'm approaching this is the way I'm going to make more money is kind of through volume. But the beauty of more volume is hopefully I'll be able to hire more staff. And what I get a kick out of from a personal perspective is I enjoy connecting people who want to work with jobs. So separate from making money, that's, I've always lived like a purpose-driven life, and in education, I wanted to connect people with what they wanted to do. Most people don't want to be cleaners, but I've reached out to workforce or agencies and I say, look, I'll create a schedule. If you have students who are getting their GED, ESL, or training for another skill, I'll work with you while they're in school to build out training where they'll get job experience on their resume, but it supports them the income they need while they go into school to get a better job, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, that's my 30 years of education coming into this, where it gives some meaning. It's not simply about making money. I
Yeah.
need to know that I'm improving someone's life. And I know I'm not going to make them rich, but how can I work this to be supportive of them furthering themselves?
That's beautiful, Richard. I'm hearing you're building a staircase for people and you're finding people who need that staircase to get to the next level. And you're finding ways to build flexibility into it, recognizing they're not going to be your employees for the next 10 or 15 years, and you probably don't want them to be. But for a couple of years, they can be great employees while you help them get to that next place.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have
Well,
no problem. Somebody comes to me and say, look, I got a better job. I'm moving on. To me, that's a win, you know?
yeah. Well, Richard, I'm curious for you to contrast what your life was like in the job you were working at before and what it feels like working the job that you're in now. Help us understand what has changed for you and how has that impacted you personally?
So it's funny. I was sharing this with someone earlier today. In the nonprofit arena, your goal is to take an individual, right, who most likely has gone through or going through some form of trauma, many times because of poverty, housing insecurity, food insecurity, and maybe all different types of levels of neglect or abuse. And you are trying either holistically or through a particular approach and service, trying to transform this person's life, right? And almost always in the nonprofit arena, you're doing more with less. You don't have enough resources to provide the meaningful PD the staff need. You're always kind of running on empty. In the for-profit arena, the goal is much simpler. You identify the service or product that you have. You identify what is the cost and then how much you want to make profit on, and then you deliver on that. And your goal is to basically make a profit, right? It's a much more simpler goal than in the nonprofit arena of trying to transform a person's life, many times who will be fighting you each step of the way, right? So that has been a huge difference of like, wow, it's this simple. Now, I think within the for-profit arena of being an entrepreneur, I think probably the biggest hurdle is the uncertainty, right? When I worked before, I knew I was getting a salary. There was a certain calendar and I knew clearly my role. Now, as an entrepreneur, I have freedom, but with freedom comes responsibility. It's all on me, right? I need to be very honest with myself of what I know and what I don't know, and then try and find the right people for what I don't know. But there is a huge level of uncertainty. You know, if the economy grows and people feel wealthier and they have more disposable income, that will indirectly help my business. If tariffs go up and people's belts tighten, people lose jobs, I may lose business. So I also have to be clear on what I can control and what I can't control, right? But learning to live with the uncertainty of the future can be scary. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges when you're an entrepreneur that you got to face and kind of deal with. And not letting things be personal. There have been a number of people have asked for quotes and I've given and I've gotten the job. But then there are some people who said, thank you, but no, thank you. I've never responded. And you can't take it personally. Like a great baseball player will get three hits out of every 10 at bats. That is considered a great baseball player, right? I'm not going to land every client that contacts me or that I reach out to. And I have to learn to accept that rejection. It's not necessarily personal. So that is something that can mess with one's psyche, and that's a learning curve too.
I love it when anyone uses baseball to explain life. And yes, Aaron Judge struck out what, 144 times last year? So he might be the best batter in the world right now. Well, not the last
Exactly.
4 days. Not the last 4 days, but over the season. Richard, I really want to thank you for taking the time. I think you've brought up some really interesting things throughout this interview that will be really helpful for someone looking at an acquisition. I think the idea of building a relationship of trust with the seller and how to think about ways to vet whether the story that they're sharing with you is actually aligned with what's happening within the business as a way to determine whether that trust is warranted before you make a big purchasing decision. That's a huge consideration and a way to de-risk a business. And I personally love your approach of thinking about how what you do in the for-profit world creates better lives for people as well, right? This idea of creating a stepping stool or a staircase for them to a better life. So really want to thank you for taking the time and sharing a little bit about your story with us.
I also want to thank you. Without guidance and you guys working with me, creating the capital of purchasing a business is not easy. And that was something I realized early on. So the role guidance played in helping me understand how I can use my retirement funds to make this dream possible has been huge. If it hadn't been for that, I'd still be back at square one. So I want to thank you for, helping us, be able to be in this position.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We love being just a small part of your story, Richard. You and Cindy.
It's not small, but it was a really important piece. So I really thank you.
All right. Thanks again.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Create the Life You Want podcast. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to future episodes by clicking the subscribe button, you know where. If you're an aspiring business owner, you may also want to subscribe to the Create the Life You Want newsletter for more inspiration and tips delivered to your inbox every week. You can find the link to that in the show notes, as well as on my personal website, jeremyames.com. If you've already decided you want to start or buy a business, consider exploring your financing options by heading to our sponsor's website at www.guidantfinancial.com. That's GUIDANT financial.com. See you in the next episode.